Hello everyone, and welcome back to week 5 of our virtual Read Alouds. This week we're also going to start to build some background knowledge on how the civil rights movement can be connected to some of the organizing that's happening right now. How this movement inspired a lot of other marginalized or oppressed groups to unify and organize towards a common goal. This week, we'll be moving from pages 26 to 31. And during that time, we'll be checking our understanding as we go to make sure that we understand what the book is really trying to tell us. Remember, if you see two parts in a question, both parts are important. So, why or why not, even if it's a short snippet at an end of a question, requires us to dig deeper, to think about not only an event, but why it was important. So I'm starting on page 26 with the subheading, Freedom Riders. In 1961, an organization called the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, decided to expand efforts against segregation. It would address the issue of buses traveling between states. Though legally integrated, buses and waiting rooms were still practicing segregation in the South. CORE planned a series of freedom rides to raise public awareness and inspire change. CORE's director, James Farmer, informed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, of his plans. Because the buses and stations were legally integrated, the passengers, called Freedom Riders, would not be breaking any laws. White riders would sit in the back of the bus, and African American riders in the front. African American riders would use the white restrooms, while white riders would use those labeled colored. Remember, this is a historical term. This is a term that was used in the 1960s to talk about African American or Black communities. So this is no longer a word that we use when we are discussing these communities. On May 4th, the first ride began in Washington, D.C., with 2 buses heading south towards New Orleans, Louisiana. The first 10 days of the ride were relatively peaceful. Then, after leaving Atlanta, Georgia on May 14th, one of the buses was firebombed. Several Freedom Riders were hospitalized. The other bus was forced to stop in Birmingham, Alabama, by a gang of angry whites. The riders were beaten, and the bus drivers refused to take the riders any farther. Now, at the bottom, I see a picture of one of these buses. It has the caption, "The Freedom Riders met with violent resistance from segregationists." So I'm thinking back to that word segregationist with the root segregation. So these are people who wanted to keep races apart. I'm starting again on page 28. SNCC takes over. Now, before I get started, I know that I need to pay attention to my text feature up here at the top that says the National Guard was called in to protect Freedom Riders. Now, I know that the National Guard is a branch of our federal defense system, so that means that the federal government had to come down and protect individuals inside states whose states were not protecting them. As the CORE rides ended, SNCC stepped in. U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy supported the Freedom Riders. With his help, SNCC hired new bus drivers and received a promise of protection from the state of Alabama. So now the state of Alabama is saying, yes, We are going to step in and protect you from citizens in the state of Alabama who are not following the laws. But between Birmingham and Montgomery, the protection disappeared. Arriving in Montgomery, the riders were met by a mob. They were again beaten and several were hospitalized. Kennedy called in federal marshals. Several civil rights leaders, including King, rallied in Montgomery to support the Freedom Riders. Violence against the riders and their supporters erupted in the city. Giving in to Kennedy's pressure, Alabama Governor John Patterson finally sent the Alabama National Guard to put down the violence. The riders made it to Jackson, Mississippi. When they arrived at the station, they were taken to the local jail and then sent to the state prison for 60 days. Freedom Riders continued arriving in Jackson in more buses and continued to be arrested. By the end of the summer, Attorney General Kennedy called for the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue regulations to end segregation on buses that traveled across state lines. The regulations were set to take effect on November 1st, 1961. But it would be 2 years before segregation in stations and buses ended across the South. Walking through Birmingham, King traveled tirelessly throughout the South, giving speeches and helping organize demonstrations. So I'm thinking back to my glossary. What does the word demonstration mean? He and the SCLC helped gain support and attention for civil rights efforts across the region. In 1963, the SCLC turned its attention to Birmingham, Alabama, where lunch counters, movie theaters, and other businesses were still segregated. The city's government was in turmoil, with its elected leaders in the process of being driven out of office. King entered Birmingham in the midst of these troubles and organized a series of demonstrations. The SCLC organized a mass march with hundreds of people walking through the streets carrying signs and singing songs. Boycotts and sit-ins were also organized. The demonstrations resulted in thousands of arrests that overcrowded Birmingham jails. King was arrested more than once. Many people felt the SCLC's protests were badly timed because Birmingham was experiencing political upheaval. So remember, they said that all of their officials, like their mayor and their commissioners, were being driven out of office. So this upheaval means that all of those city officials, there's chaos in all of those offices. The demonstrations began to lose support. To reach Birmingham's adults, King and the SCLC turned to children. Older students were recruited and they led marches. I'm going to pause right there so I can take a look at all of the text features that I see around this text. First, I'm going to look up at the top corner to see this portrait of Martin Luther King Jr. while he was in prison. The caption says, Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed multiple times for peaceful protest. So, we know that civil disobedience, that term that we've talked about again and again, means standing up for what you believe in, even if that means breaking a rule. So, even if he was doing it non-violently, remember these are peaceful protests, he was still against laws that he believed were unethical. So he and hundreds of other people were jailed multiple times just so they could stand up for what they believe in and against these unjust or immoral laws that we know are wrong. So now I'm going to jump to the resource at the bottom of my page, which says a first-hand look at the letter from Birmingham jail. After being arrested and jailed in April 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. read a letter in a Birmingham newspaper written by 8 white Alabama clergymen. Now, clergymen are religious leaders, so preachers. So these are religious leaders writing in a newspaper about Martin Luther King Jr. and his movement. Let's see what they said. They urged that the fight for civil rights take place in the courts and that the demonstrations stop. From his jail cell, King wrote a response, which has become known as the letter from Birmingham jail. The letter explains why he continued his efforts despite criticism. See page 60 for a link to view the full text of King's letter. This week, you don't even have to go to page 60. There is actually a resource inside our weekly materials that will link you to the letter from Birmingham jail. There's also a quick writing assignment where you can reflect on King's words and what they mean for us today for extra credit. So now I'm jumping back into my text. When I stopped reading, I heard all about how the SCLC was using young students to lead demonstrations. We're picking up on thousands. Thousands of young people participated. In an effort to stop the marches, Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, ordered his men to turn fire hoses on the demonstrators. The water from the high-pressure hoses knocked people off their feet and slammed them against walls or down upon the pavement. After one incident, some 2,500 protesters were arrested. Most of them were under the age of 18. Finally, with the eyes of the world watching, President John F. Kennedy, the brother of Attorney General Robert Kennedy, made an announcement. President Kennedy declared the situation in the South a moral crisis. He announced that action had to be taken in Congress. Remember, this is the body that makes our laws. They write laws that apply to everyone in the United States. And that he would help push forward new civil rights laws. Now, we're going to jump to our insert right here. This is labeled A View from Abroad. So I know that the word abroad means from a different country or from a different place. So if this is a view from abroad, I'm going to make a prediction that this is about how people from other places saw the civil rights movement from their point of view. It says, Eugene Bull Connor's actions did not go unnoticed. His use of fire hoses, police dogs, and clubs to fight protesters was reported in newspapers internationally. Images of the violence against demonstrators, many of them children, shocked the world. People from many countries spoke out in support of the civil rights movement in the United States. They were impressed with Martin Luther King Jr.'s stance on conducting nonviolent demonstrations. In 1964, King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, Norway.